Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Redaction Politics Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the recent election in New Zealand, which just turned out a landslide victory for Labour's Jacinda Ardern. She's got a majority government, which is the first majority government since the introduction of MMP, of mixed member proportional representation. What is that? Who is Jacinda Ardern? This is what we're here to discuss. I'm joined by our redaction reporter and Redaction's resident Kiwi, Richard Hansen. How are you doing?
I'm very well.
Excellent. Let's start by giving our viewers who aren't familiar a bit of background. So, what are the major parties in New Zealand? What is MMP? How does the electoral system work?
Okay, well, strap in, guys. So New Zealand has had a system called mixed member proportional, MMP, since 1996. We voted in a referendum 3 years earlier on changing the electoral system. We used to have first past the post, just like we do here in the UK. So effectively what happens is you get, as a voter, you get 2 votes. You get one for a constituency, or an electorate is what we call it. And you also get another vote for a party. You have a party vote and an electorate vote, and you can split your ticket if you like. So what happens at the end is, obviously if whoever wins the most, a plurality of votes in an electorate is elected to Parliament to represent that constituency. And then any party who receives more than 5% of the party vote gets a proportion of elected MPs based on how much percent they received. And that all depends on how many electorate MPs they received as well. So it normally, till Saturday, leads to coalitions. We've never before had one party being able to govern in its own right. So New Zealand has 120 seats in its one chamber. So obviously you need 61 or 60 actually, because you need a speaker to form a government, and that's how that works. And so the major party players, so you've got the Labour Party, centre-left party, not dissimilar to the Labour Party in this country, the Australian Labour Party, etc. On the other side, you've got what we call national. National are the Tories, effectively. They're blue, centre-right, the neoliberals, etc. To the right of them, you've got a party called ACT. And to the left of Labour, you've got the Greens. And in the centre, you've got a party called New Zealand First, who are socially conservative and populist, but are centrist in their outlook. There are obviously some other fringe parties. There's also the Maori Party, who are looking like they're going to have 1 seat in this parliament, having been wiped out last time. Because there are a number of exclusively Maori electorates in New Zealand as well. So what's happened is Jacinda Ardern and the Labour Party, for the first time since the introduction of MMP, secured an outright majority. So I think the last I looked, I think they're on course to get 64 seats. And National, who have come second, have just been decimated. 35 seats, they lost 20. The makeup of the last parliament, Labour was forced into coalition with the Greens and New Zealand First to form government, and it doesn't look like they're going to need them this time.
Yes, just to give some perspective here for our viewers who haven't got them. Numbers are Labour got 49% of the vote. 49, wow. National Party 27%, ACT 8%, Green Party 6%, roughly. Maori's got about 1%, and New Zealand First, despite being wiped out completely, still managed to rake in 2.67% of the vote.
Yes, and crucially, New Zealand First did not make it above that 5% threshold, so obviously they're not going to have any elected list MPs, and they didn't win in any constituencies. They came third in the constituency of Northland, which is normally where they do rather well, and their charismatic Never Say Die leader, Winston Peters, didn't bow out of politics. So I'm not sure we've seen the last of Winston Peters. He's been around as long as I can remember. I think I read he was first elected to Parliament in 1978. So, he's
something of a political veteran then.
He is something of a political veteran. But for those who aren't particularly familiar with New Zealand politics, having one party receive an outright majority is fairly outrageous. I mean, we're talking to give that British perspective, that's the equivalent of like Tony Blair winning in 1997, 400 plus seats against the Tories, 100 less than 200. But it remains to be seen what Jacinda can do with this massive majority. There are a couple of arguments floating around that, okay, well, Labour's won a thumping majority, so it gives them a platform to enact some really progressive policies. But I actually disagree with that. I think if you look at some of the outrageous electorates that Labour won, I mean, for those of us who are I'll list them, but I mean, Labour won electorates like Ilam. I mean, Ilam is an electorate in Christchurch, in the leafy suburbs of Christchurch, the suburbs of Fendleton and Ilam, and it's where my grandparents lived, and I spent a lot of time growing up. And they have absolutely no right to be winning seats like that, true blue ribbon seats like Nelson. They were ahead for a long time in Taranaki King Country, which is Jim Bolger's old seat, the Prime Minister in the mid 90s. Really rural, it's really quite affluent blue ribbon seats. So it looks as if a lot of National Party voters have switched and have lent Labour their vote. So it suggests to me that Labour are going to need to govern from the centre if they're going to keep those votes. And I think they'd be well placed to look at the 1987 election results. Cast your minds back. Well, there's people familiar with that. Our Prime Minister David Lange, who is a Labour Prime Minister, who had just enacted a bunch of really quite radical economic reforms, deregulation, all the kind of 1980s things that you'd expect, floating of the dollar, and he won an absolute landslide majority in 1987, and he took, seriously conservative seats. Now, then, in 3 years later, he got absolutely decimated because he didn't necessarily tack to the centre. So I think Ardern and the Labour Party might, if they want to stay in power anyway, do well to look at that historical precedent. But time will tell.
Because of course in New Zealand there are elections every 3 years, so they will have to present themselves before the electorate again not too long. Whereas in the UK they're every 5 years, well, usually.
Blessing and a curse. I personally think 3 years is probably not. It's probably a bit short. 5 years is probably a bit long. I mean, I think 4 years is probably about right because you're constantly looking over your shoulder at the next election. That being said, it does remain to be seen. You never know. The Greens may be invited into a coalition anyway, despite the fact that Labour don't need them. That would be an indication that they might that they're probably going to be more progressive. I'm not sure they will, only because if you listen to Ardern's election night victory speech, there was no olive branch to the left at all. She was all about unity and governing for everybody, and but there is a political strategy for letting the Greens in, because then you have someone to blame if you don't manage to enact your policy programs. And New Zealand has not been.
What happened to New Zealand First, basically, this time?
Yes, exactly. So New Zealand First have been in government.
Might be a bit wary if that offer were on the table.
Yeah, Winston Peters has been in government a number of times, and he's been in government with both the Tories, both National and Labour, as New Zealand First. So obviously, being in the centre, they can kind of tilt ever which way. And it is very convenient to having a junior coalition partner. Look at what happened to the Lib Dems after 2010. Obviously it's a slightly different situation. Arguably the Lib Dems shot themselves in the foot a little bit with backflips on things like student fees and things. But in New Zealand, it's been 25 years since there's been an outright majority government, and so nobody really has much of an idea of how to conduct that. A lot of sort of political veterans of the National Party lost their seats. So it's great that it's a more of a sort of young, fresh outlook, in terms of MPs. But I think they would do well just by looking historically at maybe what mistakes to not make if they want to remain popular.
So just to give a bit more broader context, we've alluded to this already, but What's roughly the history of sort of the political geography of New Zealand?
I'm very much generalizing here, and I apologize to anybody who I inadvertently offend by saying this. Rural is national, urban is Labour, by and large. There's obviously exceptions to that. Every electorate in Wellington is Labour. Every electorate in Christchurch is Labour. Every electorate in Hamilton is Labour. Every electorate in Dunedin is Labour. There are a couple of Auckland Central went to the Greens. Chloe Swarbrick, who I'm fairly sure is under 30. Is the new.
It went viral when she said "Okay, Boomer" to who was it to?
One of her opponents. She's not one to back down from an argument, and good on her. You know, she's done really well. Her campaign was second to none. Her ground game was. So Chloe Swarbrick, Green MP, elected in Auckland Central. There's an ACT MP in Epsom, which is a very affluent area of Auckland. But by and large, the rural areas go to National, and the urban areas go Labour.
Let's talk a bit more about ACT, because they've suddenly had a surge this time round.
Yes.
How did that happen?
Disenfranchised National Party voters. So the National Party have gone through 3 leaders this year. Whether or not you agree with Judith Collins's personality or a policy platform, you got to feel sorry for it. It was, a bit of a. I was hearing the phrase on Saturday morning. It was a bit of a hospital pass for her to try and take the National Party into the next general election. So where have those National Party voters gone? They've gone to ACT and they've gone to Labour. And that's part of the reason why ACT, I think, will have something like 9 or 10 MPs now off the list, in addition to their one electorate MP, their leader David Seymour, and that's up from just one in the last Parliament. So, but even so, if you look at the right-leaning bloc in the Parliament, you've got 45-ish seats, and the left-leaning bloc 75-ish seats. So it's a thumping mandate.
What separates ACT from the Nationals in terms of platform?
Largely economic policy, by and large. They were formed, I think in probably the early 1990s, as a sort of more libertarian alternative, and they've ebbed and flowed. They've always been there or thereabouts. Obviously, when National do well, ACT tend to not do particularly well, because they manage to coalesce the whole right vote around them. Whereas if National don't do so well, then ACT kind of tend to surge a bit like the Greens and Labour. Some people sort of go between the two of them depending on how they feel on the left.
Okay, let's get to the big elephant in the room. COVID-19. Into all this.
So New Zealand, by quote to Jacinda Ardern, went hard and went early. They locked down as early as they possibly could. I think New Zealand spent 6 weeks under stage 4 lockdown. Was it 6 weeks? It might have been slightly more than that. So where literally nothing was open, much similar to our kind of form of lockdown. But New Zealand did something which was pretty unprecedented, at least over here in Europe. It was emulated by Australia. New Zealand's closed its borders entirely to all non-citizens. I think if you're a returning resident, you're allowed in. But to get into New Zealand, you then have to complete 14 days of managed isolation in a hotel, which you pay for at your own expense. I think it's $3,100 if you want to spend 14 days in a hotel. It's guarded by the army, and you're allowed out for an hour a day, supervised exercise, and they've managed to largely control COVID. They did have an incident. I think it was July, August time, where they had managed to eliminate COVID. There were no cases and no community transmission, but it was reintroduced, believe it or not, by a British couple who were given I assume they were dual.
So many favours.
I assume they were dual citizens, but they went back to New Zealand. I think it was because of for a funeral of a family member, which obviously you were allowed to go for. But they were positive. I don't think they knew, but they drove from Auckland to Wellington. And met a number of people along the way, and it was reintroduced. It's since been brought under control. I think they last reported that they had 3 cases and they knew exactly where all of them were. So, it can be, New Zealand has done very well out of COVID, and credit to Ardern and credit to the Labour Party for putting it front and centre. But, in some ways, she's been very lucky that this turn of events has occurred the way that it has, just with the electoral timing.
Because looking at some of the opinion polling, obviously Labour won with 49% of the vote, but as late as February 2020, the Nationals were on 46% of the vote in one opinion poll. I cannot read my own handwriting.
41. So National 46, Labour 41 in February. And then I think the following poll, which was conducted in May or June time, I think had Labour on 59 and the Nats on 32. Yeah. Well, a couple of things to say about that is it's important to remember that in the last Parliament, National were by far the largest party, despite being opposition. Just by the fact that the way MMP works, National had I think 56 out of 56 seats, so only 4 short. But obviously Labour managed to cobble together majority, but they only had 40 something themselves. Yeah. So despite being smaller than National, they were leading the government. So a margin of 46-41 wouldn't have necessarily chucked Labour out of power, but it certainly would have made a majority government. I'm going to call it now outright impossible. But the other world leaders could take note. If manage to get your COVID response correct, your popularity will follow. They brought the New Zealand public with them. Jacinda talked about sort of a team of 5 million being the population of New Zealand. We are a team of 5 million. We're all in this together, and there was largely complete community cohesion in this first lockdown.
Obviously, we've mentioned that several rural seats that usually vote National went to Labour for the first time ever. Why did they flip? The COVID response?
Partly, but I wouldn't really characterise it that way. No, not really too many. Labour won a lot more party vote, whereas there weren't too many rural electorates that went red. So you probably have seen a number of rural voters splitting their ticket, probably voting Labour in for one tick and their national MP in the other. I think you've got the COVID response. It was certainly something to do with it, and just sort of a rally around the leader kind of moment. With
sort of
New Zealand.
There's a pandemic on. Do we really need to change a government right now?
Yeah, exactly. But not only that, there's a pandemic on, and look what our government seems to have done. New Zealand is looking around the world and thinking, God, we're really quite lucky here. I'm a big rugby fan, as all New Zealanders really should be. And I got up really early on Sunday morning and watched the All Blacks play the Wallabies, and it really does. It's really quite emotional. Seeing a full Eden Park, 60,000 fans, no masks, no social distancing, and because they don't need to, because there's no community transmission, so they're just carrying on life as normal now. So that's the envy of the world, really.
Of course, absolutely. I have an uncle who lives in New Zealand. He's originally from there, and I just think, I should go and live with him now, shouldn't I?
Should do, but we won't let you in, mate. So unless you got a New Zealand passport, I'm afraid. Yeah, and I really believe that was one of the major stepping stones to securing the response, as opposed to in other countries. I mean, obviously New Zealand is lucky in the sense that it's quite isolated. It's geographically very, very distant from everywhere else. It's an island. It does have structural advantages, but with different leadership, I think it would have suffered a lot more.
Speaking of different leadership, where does this leave the Nationals now? Where do they go?
Well, there's gonna be a bit of knife sharpening, I think. It's difficult to
still in the top job for now.
I would think so, given that she obviously only came into the top job immediately before the election was called. She obviously didn't resign in her concession speech. Some were thinking she may, myself included. But I think it's going to be very difficult for Labour to govern successfully in this next 3 years. New Zealand's in recession already. The economy shrunk 12% in the last quarter. That's not insignificant. It's probably less than a number of other advanced economies around the world are going to shrink. But there were a few things which were quite lucky for Labour. When I say lucky, it's probably bad taste, but electorally advantageous. You've got the Christchurch mosque attack, and there was a volcanic eruption. There were some, and COVID obviously, but there were some focal points where you needed strong leadership and an ability to sort of rally around the leader, and that did make Labour popular. So now they're probably going to have to run on their record. So it really depends on what they get done and how much of the country they're willing to take with them. And that's why I personally believe that if they want to remain successful, then they need to be centrist, as much as that's going to annoy their base.
Obviously, Jacinda is well known internationally for things like you mentioned, the COVID response, her response to the Christchurch.
Mm-hmm.
What's happened domestically under her watch beyond that?
She's enacted a number of really good policies, expansion of things like parental leave, cracking down on foreign ownership of housing, like big sort of international conglomerates, making sure that, houses are more affordable, more money's gone into health, more money's gone into education. They're a Labour government, they're going to be spending money on public services. But there's still too much wealth still a lot of inequality in New Zealand, and I think it will probably, it's obviously far too early to say, we're 2 days removed from the election, but if New Zealand's economy is sluggish in its recovery, I could see National coming through and saying, look, competent conservatism, economic conservatism will, we've got to tighten the belts, tighten the purse strings. This is going to, make things better. So that obviously remains to be seen. But the COVID recovery, rather than the immediate response, is probably going to require a bit more nuanced.
Okay. With the Nationals, they had 3 leaders in the space of a year. Why?
Just in internal infighting, popularity. It's very hard to run against somebody as popular as Jacinda Ardern, just as a leader, and as I think many political parties of different stripes know, it's much easier to be in government than it is to be in opposition when it comes to keeping the party unified. There was also a quite prominent MP who sort of broke away to form a sort of fringe party called Advance New Zealand, which obviously didn't end up doing well at all, but still peddled conspiracy theories and things. So you've got people on the fringes of the party sort of voicing the displeasure, and I guess National thought it was better to change leader. I'm not sure. 3 years ago Labour did exactly the same thing. It's important to remember. So the day before the New Zealand election was called in 2017, the day before Bill English called the election, Jacinda Ardern was installed as Labour leader. The day before, and the international political watchers, I think, forget this fact. So she obviously didn't have much of a record to run on herself, because she said, I'm a fresh leader, I'm a breath of fresh air, put your trust in me. So I wonder if National may have thought, well, if it worked for them, maybe it'll work for us.
But of course, Jacinda didn't win the last election.
No.
And it was through Winston Peters' support that she became PM.
Yes, it was. But Labour were, like, if Andrew Little stayed leader of the Labour Party in 2017, they'd be in the 30s in terms of seats. Jacinda got Labour to a position where it could cobble together. I shouldn't use the phrase cobble together because it sounds like it's unnecessary. Where Labour to a position where she could form a coalition government with the other left-leaning parties.
Okay. Speaking of Winston Peters, what happens to him now?
He just won't die. I mean, good on him. He's done. He's fought for what he believes in, and he's very popular in some circles. But he goes up and he goes down. I'd be very surprised if we've seen the last of him. I read something today on Twitter to suggest that Winston Peters' elder brother retired at the age of 87. I'm not sure what he did for a living. Wasn't a politician. So he clearly comes from kind of proud stock. And he's a doer, is Winston Peters. He's always out and about and chatting to people and, going on television and having an opinion on God knows everything. So I'm not sure what he'd do in his retirement. So I'd be, we'll sit here in 3 years and you never know. He might walk into the beehive yet.
Okay. The Greens did quite well this time. Given that Labour was surging so much, how did they manage to keep that going? Why didn't all of the left-wing support consolidate around Labour?
Well, partly because of the political system. You will have had a number of people vote Labour in their electorate and vote Greens, party vote Green, because people recognise that if you two-tick Green, and when I say two-tick, the electorate and party vote, it's arguably a bit of a wasted vote if you're not going to, if your MP is unlikely to get in. But it just goes to show that there is appetite on the left for a lot more reform. Also, it's important to remember there were two referendums that we had at the same time. They haven't announced the results yet. That happens on the 30th of October. One about euthanasia legalization, and one about the legalization of cannabis. And it suggests that both of those referendums will pass. Yes, both of which will become legal. And obviously the Greens, as the progressive force in New Zealand, is sort of led the kind of yes campaign on both of those issues, and I think that probably translated into some more votes for them.
Okay. And the lady of the hour, Jacinda Ardern. You said you'd like to see her govern from the centre now. What more specifically is that going to look like, do you think?
Just sort of economic pragmatism. Realizing that we're gonna have to not so much exclusively spend our way out of this economic downturn, and just a realization that she's going to have to take large swathes of the country with her, who may not be normally akin to going with a Labour government. She could throw some red meat to rural farmers and subsidies and various other things which they need. But just building a broad coalition, I think, is important. And I don't mean that in an electoral sense. I just mean in terms of popularity. Like I said, it's almost as if Labour's majority is going to be its handbrake when it comes to enacting progressive, seriously progressive legislation. But hey, you never know. Maybe they'll go into coalition with the Greens, but I doubt it.
Did the majority surprise you at all?
Yes, only because I was thinking about this, and I must be the worst. I have the worst luck when it comes to these things. I'm gonna put my cards on the table. I was really pleased to see them get a majority. But it was the first election I'd watched live since the election of Kevin Rudd in 2007 in Australia.
Yeah.
And I've watched a lot of elections. I've watched every National Party win in the New Zealand election. Obviously, I watched the election 3 years ago in New Zealand, but at the end of the election, it didn't. Obviously, we didn't have a winner then, so it remained to be seen who was going to govern. Obviously, watched Trump. Obviously, watched Brexit. I watched the 2015, 17, and 19 general elections, none of which particularly thrilled me. So it was nice to be on the winning end for once.
Yes, of course, because you were doing our live tweets for
I was.
Yeah.
I was. It made the pre-dawn start all the more worth it.
Absolutely.
and you know, it does make me smile. You know, things like the husband, Jacinda Ardern's husband, is a guy called Clark Gayford, and he's a little bit of a celebrity in New Zealand. He has a fishing show, and he's done various other sort of TV personalities. So he's a chef, and you know, the media were camped outside of Jacinda's house, obviously, as the polls closed. So what did Clark do? He just went and bought the media pack a load of food that he cooked up for them. That is peak New Zealand, absolute peak New Zealand. It was heartening to see.
Absolutely. Okay, it's probably time for us to start to slowly wrap up. Just before we go, any final thoughts?
Be cautious as to how you govern. You know, Labour have a tendency of, you know, getting a mandate and then perhaps spending their political capital in a way that maybe they shouldn't. So I think in some ways, look, you know, being able to govern for a fair old while is more helpful. You know, looking further into the future is good. Obviously, get the COVID response right, and the country will probably go with you. But be cautious. I mean, have a glass of something, but it's time for work now.
Like you say, get the COVID response right.
Absolutely.
Some other world leaders might like to pay attention there.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Obviously, next month, only a couple of weeks away now, we'll have an election where it might be quite a different story, where a certain character might have not handled it so well.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if that is in fact the way that goes, it's almost proved our point, really, in that, you know, I mean, I know that the two countries are chalk and cheese in terms of size and influence, but you know, if you get your COVID response right, you re-elected in a landslide. You know, if you perhaps don't get your COVID response right, you could be out of power before your time. So yeah, and you know, and a similar thing in this country. I mean, I think it's only luck that Boris Johnson doesn't have to face the electorate now, from his perspective, you know, because the things are being bungled quite so badly.
On that note, though, with the US election, just to throw a reminder out, Redaction Politics is doing a all-nighter live stream. We're raising money in the process for the charity Safe Passage. Really good cause. Please check out their website and please donate generously.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that if Georgia goes blue, I owe James a beer.
And if it doesn't, I owe Richard one.
Indeed.
Oh, this will be fun, won't it?
It will. I'm still holding out hope that maybe by 4 a.m. British time, so 11 p.m. On the East Coast, when California, etc., are called, that we might have 270 electoral votes for Joe Biden. But you never know. It could be a long old night. It could be a long old week. Who knows?
Who knows? Absolutely. Okay, thanks everyone very much for tuning in, and we'll be seeing you very soon next weekend, I believe, to discuss the US election, just for our live stream. So stay tuned. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.